Hi everyone, thanks for having me. So my name's Elissa and I'm a student at City University of London. I'm in my final year of my PhD, so I submit in September, so I don't have any final findings to show you today. But what I kind of decided to do was just to kind of give a background to the topic. I want to talk a little bit about myself as well, which we've been encouraged to do, and just show kind of where I am up to in the analysis, with a view to obviously like maybe coming and presenting next year with some findings. So yeah, I'll make a start. So the overall project, my PhD is one part, 1/3 of this, which is the study one. But the overall project is looking to understand the differences and similarities between autism and personality disorder and women in people in women and people socialized as female. So this is in conjunction with City University and also the McPinn Foundation, who do a lot of research with lived experience researchers. This is a co-produced lived experience project. Myself, I'm neurodivergent, I'm a trauma survivor, so my kind of lived experience was valued, and that was part of my application when applying for the PhD. And also Jenny Parker is our lived experience researcher. She's an autistic lady, also diagnosed as having a personality disorder, and we have a lived experience panel who worked alongside the design and part of the analysis as well of the data. And that's a really important part of the research, really. So a bit about myself. I'm a psychiatric nurse too. I trained in the UK. I trained in the UK. I'm coming up to my 11th year of being a nurse now. I work clinically exclusively up until 8 years into my registration, and then I kind of sidestepped into research. I did a master's in mental health, in psychological research with advanced statistics. And then I started a split post with the health service where I was working, Sheffield Health and Social Care, and working in I was already working as a clinical nurse in the CMHT in the community team, and I worked 2 days a week as well in the research team, and I did that for a few years. And then I actually applied for the PhD. It was I saw this advertised and had to jump through a good few hoops to get. And I was actually chosen to be the PhD student for that. So it's a real honour for me. Personality disorder specifically is something that's been really interesting and a massive part of my training and working as a nurse. I really enjoyed working with people who had the diagnosis of having a personality disorder. But I also found was really kind of worried and upset by the fact that we work with people, we diagnose them with this diagnosis, and then people sometimes they get better, a lot of the time they get better, but a lot of the time people have a really difficult trajectory through services, and it's really quite problematic. And that was really important to me. It's something that we weren't quite understanding. We're also kind of telling people that they have disordered personality or BPD, borderline personality, or more recently, emotionally unstable personality disorder. And more often than not, these are women, although not always, and more often than not, these people have experienced trauma, particularly sexual trauma in their childhood. And that people come to services and they're offered treatments which may either be unhelpful or even actually re-traumatizing and damaging. So we're thinking about what we call iatrogenic harm, so harm by services, and they're very difficult to move on, and it's very difficult to offer them some recovery, for them to experience kind of recovery in their lives. And as I went through my kind of career, I also had a real interest in autism. Some of the women that I worked with were also autistic. They may not have had a diagnosis, but it was something that was certainly in their notes or their formulation. And I began to think for a number of years, there's a link here. And also there's been some really high profile cases, particularly in the UK, for women who've been young women usually have been diagnosed as having a personality disorder and then believed to be actually autistic, and young women have lost their lives through that process as well. So that's why I believe, and we believe, this research is really important. Just move to the next. Sorry. Okay, so the two sides of the same coin. This was actually something that one of my participants said to me when we were discussing the similarities and differences between the two diagnoses. And certainly there are many overlaps between autism and personality disorder, which obviously leads to people being diagnosed as having a personality disorder. And we wanted to investigate what was the actual real lived experience of autistic women and women diagnosed with personality disorder, and where there are actual similarities and differences that we could kind of maybe tease out or better understand. In reality, the differences are definitely few and far between. If we're thinking about people's lived experience, every person is very different. There's so much variation between people that kind of working out what these big differences are is like, it's been really difficult. Okay, so as I've said, someone may have autistic needs that are not recognised by services. They may be diagnosed with personality disorder and trauma as well. People being cared for by mental health services, increasingly trauma becomes kind of forgotten about. And I say that myself as a clinician who work with people, that we so often work with people who have terrible trauma in their lives, and actually how trauma impacts people's behaviours and experiences. We talk about trauma informed services, but unless that's actually a genuine trauma informed services, it can be quite tokenistic, and that's a massive part. And in my research, I think we found that people's trauma experiences have underpinned everything that we've been looking at. So it's really important to kind of have an awareness of that. So very briefly, I just want to show you the breadth of the people that have been involved in this. As I said, this is a lived experience research. We've had many clinicians who from all different walks, from all different backgrounds input. We've had our lived experience panel, which have been absolutely fantastic. They've helped us co-design the materials and patient-facing materials for the research. And I've said a little bit, so just to recap, why might autism be under-recognised in women, particularly women socialised as female, as having a personality disorder? So when we think about autism, we might have some stereotypes in our mind of someone like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, of someone who's kind of quite rude, doesn't pick up on social cues, has these kind of strong special interests around science, maybe. And actually, women and people socialised, autistic women and people socialised as female may present actually quite differently from that stereotype. So, as in the last 10 years, the evidence has changed. There's been much more research, and we do understand more how women present as autistic. But certainly, I don't feel that that's something that people are aware of in clinical services. Myself as a nurse, I never received any training about how autism might be different in women, and how that's actually really important in terms of how people are offered treatments for their mental health, how people are even dealt with, in terms of appointments and face-to-face work and things like that, and what people's autistic needs might be, and not having those autistic needs recognised or addressed it can be really difficult for people, and as well the therapies as well. So if someone is recognised, maybe that autism is said, actually that person's self-harming, maybe that person has a personality disorder as well. It can be quite a shortcut for a diagnosis in a pressured service, and they're referred to group dialectical behavioural therapy, which is one of the frontline therapies for people with diagnosed with a personality disorder. Groups for autistic people and autistic women can be really difficult. So that's just an example of why we really need to understand people's autistic experience or potential autistic experience. As I said, there's many overlaps between autism and personality disorder, or what we call personality disorder. Self-harm for one, difficulties thinking and understanding what other people are thinking and feeling, or perhaps we believe that people have difficulties in understanding and thinking what other people are feeling, what we call mentalizing. Difficulties with emotional regulation, for example, but the causes for those might be different depending if someone has autistic experience or not. And a few other things as well. And the assessment tools. So a lot of the assessment tools for autism have been designed using male participants in research. So it's based again on that kind of male understanding of autism. And actually we found other research, and this research that I've completed has found that these assessment tools don't adequately detect autistic experience in women. And mental health services. So as we know, there's lots of funding cuts in the UK, and I'm sure in other European countries as well. As a result, there's a lot of shortcuts. So people are often diagnosed in crisis, or they might say, right, you're self-harming or you're dysregulated, you must have a personality disorder. That people having the opportunity to do that kind of thorough holistic assessment that's needed. Okay, so we finished data collection. As I said, we wanted to understand these similarities and distinguishing features and lived experiences to better aid a differential diagnosis. We increasingly realised that the differences are so few and far between. There's much more overlaps that actually, rather than thinking about differentiating, we might be thinking about raising awareness, particularly of autistic experience. And also, what are the difficulties of women who are diagnosed as having as a personality disorder, as kind of gaining recognition, or maybe having an understanding or a diagnostic, a diagnosis of autism, and what are those barriers? And the limitations of the current assessment tools as well. So study 1 and study 2, that was my colleague Jenny who completed the interviews asking women diagnosed with a personality disorder what were their difficulties in that journey in accessing the autism recognition. And this would feed into study 3, which is our big quantitative study, which I won't be talking about much today. I will be focusing on mine and a little bit of study 2. So I don't want to go into detail, but this was these were my participants and variations. So we have lots of young women, lots of white women. We didn't get the kind of we weren't able to recruit from the backgrounds as much as we wanted to, different kind of ethnic backgrounds as we would have liked. But you know, that's something that's it is difficult. It's a PhD as well, so my resources were quite limited, including my time. But we recruited from various parts of the country, including Sheffield, London, and Merseyside, which is part of Liverpool. So the measures that people completed as part of my study were some of the common screening measures for autism and personality disorder. Here you might have recognised the AQ10, for example, and parts of the SCID-PD, which is parts of personality disorder assessments that are or should be used in clinical services. We completed 2 cognitive interviews of 2 of those measures. So we actually asked our participants I asked my participants, how they interpreted and understood the questions in the AQ10 and the SAPAS, which is a personality disorder screening measure, because we actually question whether these things are actually picking up what they're supposed to be picking up. And the qualitative interviews as well. So some of them are quite long. We asked people about their lived experiences of autism and personality disorder, and we orientated the interview questions around the areas we felt that there might be some overlaps and differences. So sort of thoughts and behaviours, emotional regulation, triggers, and a rigidity in thought versus flexibility, for example. And I also asked if people, if they would be willing to complete diagnostic interviews, which might be used in clinical services. So the SCID, which is personality disorder, ADOS Module 4, which is autism, although that's currently rarely used in clinical, I would say possibly rarely used in clinical services, because it's quite kind of old and that we were aware of the problems with it. And a 3DIA, which is an informant interview. So I would it was optional. I could interview a friend or a family member of a participant as well. So these aren't, I didn't complete my analysis with the thematic analysis, although it was considered. So these are not my themes, but these are the general topics that were kind of covered when I was looking at the analysis and looking at the data. So interpersonal relationships, trauma, sensory environmental, so that might be sounds, lights, as well as kind of being around people. As I said before, rigidity and flexibility, how people experience emotions and whether they can name emotions, and working out how people can understand how others think and feel, and what we call mentalizing. Okay, so I've got some quotes here. As I said, I don't have any kind of results at the moment or findings, but there's some interesting quotes that I'd like to show you. If you look at the second paragraph, I've got a couple of friends I've had for a long time that I try not to see. It's awful. They are probably my best friends, but I don't want to see them. So this is a lady, an autistic lady, who's talking about kind of feeling lonely and experiencing loneliness, also actually really struggling being around other people. And we found that being alone versus others was actually quite an interesting difference, one of the differences that did kind of come out the data. And this lady at the bottom, I'm not very good at being on my own. I need social situations. She struggles to manage her feelings and self-regulate when she's on her own, and she actually needs to be around others, which is quite different from some of the other participants, some of which may or may not have been diagnosed as being autistic. We kind of kept, for the qualitative analysis, we kept the clinical diagnosis and self-identification and where they scored on the measures separate, because we wanted this to be a really inductive piece of work. So that's kind of where we are with this. Skip on. People talked about their trauma as well. So this person was in the 500 lady at the top, was moved in and out of hospital a lot, had really difficult experiences living in care. And the lady at the bottom as well, she had a really kind of difficult home life and an invalidating home life where it wasn't safe for her to express her emotions. Sensory was really interesting. Most of our participants experience were sensitive to sensory things. So this top one is really interesting. And she talked about senses not being separate. It just feels like everything is too much. Everything's quite overwhelming. So she would not wear her glasses to reduce that sensory input. And this the lady, sorry, the non-binary person in the second paragraph talked about it's not actually noises for this person, it's usually conversation. So that interpersonal discussion of people talking at once, and that person felt like at times that might feel like directed at them, and that was a sensitivity for them. Okay. Sorry, I've just had to kind of fly through those quotes, so I'm sorry if anyone was reading them. They were really interesting, but yeah, I've got loads of other ones as well that I'm working with at the moment. But yeah, just to kind of briefly mention my methodology, I did talk about reflexive thematic analysis, but actually when I was looking at that, it was bringing up all the similarities, but we were not able to tease out these few differences that we were finding. So ideal type is a relatively new methodology, and it's a multi-case qualitative method that seeks to systematically describe naturally occurring patterns of human existence by informing categories, types, or groups with common features. And this is what we're kind of expecting in terms of looking at the presentation of autism and what we call personality disorder in women and people socialized as being female. And so we've constructed I am constructing typologies at the moment, and for each participant I used 3 sources of data. It was to create a case construction, which was like a narrative for that person, so we're able to capture that more effectively capture that lived experience for that person in the case construction. And that was taken from the qualitative, from one of the diagnostic interviews, and from the measures as well. And we compared and contrasted them. So at the moment, I've got 4 typologies that rather than kind of having a personality disorder and an autism typology, I've got 4, just to, obviously, because this kind of reflects the variation in people's lived experience. And so the plan is to kind of and again, that's been quite inductive. So we've been working with the data and not been thinking about diagnosis, but it might help to bring in clinical diagnosis, for example, to kind of help illustrate sort of where people sit in these 4 typologies. And in terms of differences, as I said before, alone versus others is something that's been quite interesting in terms of differences. Those quotes illustrated that quite well, and also the mentalizing, understanding how others think and feel. Some people felt that was quite intuitive, and other people felt that they had to learn how to do that, and that was quite difficult, and perhaps they got it wrong and felt that they negatively interpreted how others thought and felt. That's interesting in itself, because no one can ever really know how someone else thinks and feels, but that's certainly sort of something that we've been looking at in terms of differences. And just to mention as well, when we say ideal type, we're not looking for the ideal autism person and ideal personality disorder person. It's more of ideas as in examples, theories, or generalization of people's experience. So study 2, just very quickly, which was Jenny's study, where she interviewed clinicians and people with lived experience to find out what were these barriers to accessing either an autism diagnosis or helping people to, understand someone's autistic experience and therefore needs. And she's put together some early kind of like guidelines for clinicians. So I've got a box in front of that and I can't see what it says. Oh, yeah, we go. Look below the surface. What is behind a behaviour? So kind of thinking about people's experience and what actually might be the cause of that. So an autistic person might self-harm, for example, because of environmental sensitivity and overload. This is an example. Whereas someone diagnosed with a personality disorder, it might be due to feeling rejected, for example. So that's a very rough example, just to illustrate that. Clinicians should have autism on their radar, so learn about it, speak about it to colleagues, talk about it in the MDT when doing a formulation for someone. Taking time to get to know one. So people talked about being diagnosed as having a personality disorder when they were in crisis, which really should never happen. Spending longer time, obviously difficult, given that, you know, the services are so stretched, but we think that that's really important. And being open to questioning pre-existing diagnosis. If someone's got personality disorder and it's been on their record for 10 years, there's no reason why that can't be questioned if actually they're presenting in a way that could be consistent with an autistic experience, and for clinicians have confidence to do that. And to listen to people when they question autism as an explanation. So many of the participants who took part in our research had done extensive research into being autistic experience. It's not something that they just kind of had a knee-jerk reaction. There's certainly personality disorder is heavily stigmatized, so you can understand why someone might not want that, but certainly it's something that people have thought about a lot. And these are the next steps. So continuing the analysis and the cognitive interviews. Just to summarize, I think I might have gone over. We understand that there's unhelpful treatments being offered with people diagnosed as having a personality disorder, and we are finding some interesting differences. And we found some interesting features of people's experience of accessing a diagnosis of autism, that's actually quite difficult. But I continue to do my work on my analysis.